Welcome to this ANROWS webinar presented in collaboration with the Australian Human Rights Commission. My name's Heather Nancurrow. I'm the CEO of ANROWS. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today, and on behalf of ANROWS, pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are viewing this webinar. In a further acknowledgement, I'd like to recognise the impact of COVID-19 on everyone. I want to acknowledge particularly women subjected to sexual violence and domestic and family violence, and those providing frontline services addressing violence against women in our country. Today's webinar is titled Preventing and Responding to Sexual Harassment in the Workplace, a discussion. This webinar will explore the findings of the recently published Respect at Work Sexual Harassment National Inquiry Report by the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'm delighted to introduce the panel briefly now, noting that you can see their full bios online on the webinar registration page. So first we have Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins from the Australian Human Rights Commission. We also have joining us Paddy Kinnersley, CEO ARWatch, and Claire Perrett, Senior Industrial Liaison Officer, Northern Territory Working Women's Centre. The format for the webinar today will be that the presenters will each speak first, then we will have some panel discussion followed by a live Q&A. The audience can submit questions to the panel for the live Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. Just need to click on the blue icon on the top right hand of the screen and it will take you to the question box to submit your questions, and I'll remind you about that process at the end of our webinar session. So I'm now going to hand over to Kate Jenkins, Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Australian Human Rights Commission. Kate, tell us about Respect at Work report. Tell us in particular about how the report came about and what the key findings and recommendations are.
Thank you, Heather, and I'm delighted to be here today. I'd like to also pass on my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, from whose traditional lands I'm presenting today. I commenced Australia's first national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces in 2018 with the support of government, unions and employers. The inquiry was launched off the back of the global Me Too movement, which had placed a renewed spotlight on the prevalence of sexual harassment at work. And the goal of the inquiry was to examine the nature, prevalence and drivers of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces and measures to address and prevent it. And while the media has written a lot on sexual harassment, it's worth me reminding you that sexual harassment is basically unwelcome, offensive sexual conduct that's been prohibited at work under the Sex Discrimination Act since 1984. So sexual harassment can include unwelcome sexual comments, touching and online behaviour, as well as criminal sexual assault. Our Respect at Work report is the culmination of 18 months of work involving a survey of 10,000 workers, 60 public consultations involving 600 participants, 460 written submissions, economic modelling and global research. And I launched Respect at Work alongside the Honourable Marise Payne, the Minister for Women, on Friday the 6th of March 2020. Minister Payne and the Attorney General, the Honourable Christian Porter, welcomed the report and said the Australian Government would carefully consider its recommendations. They also underlined government's commitment to ensuring Australian workplaces are safe and free from sexual harassment. Many participants in the inquiry shared with me their devastating experiences of sexual harassment at work and the inadequate responses to it, including clients of the Northern Territory Working Women's Centre. Most heartbreaking was the long-term harm and the financial hardship caused by the experience. We found in the inquiry that sexual harassment is pervasive. Our survey and inquiry told us that workplace sexual harassment occurs in every industry, in every location and at every level in Australian workplaces. It's a systemic problem driven by gender inequality and intersectional disadvantage. In 2018, we found that 1 in 3 Australian workers had experienced sexual harassment at work in the last 5 years, which is up from 1 in 5 in 2012. The inquiry also allowed us to give voice to the extent of mental, physical, economic and other consequences of sexual harassment for victims, for workplaces and for the economy. Economic losses are staggering. Deloitte Access Economics modelled the economic cost of workplace sexual harassment, and they estimated workplace sexual harassment cost the Australian economy $3.8 billion in 2018. We also found that the current system for addressing workplace sexual harassment in Australia is complex and confusing for victims and for employers. It also places the onus on victims to complain, and yet we found that only 17% of people who said they experienced sexual harassment at work in fact made a complaint. So our inquiry revealed an urgent need to shift from the current reactive complaints-based approach to one that requires positive action from employers and a focus on prevention. Our Respect at Work report proposes a new approach which builds upon Australia's existing policies and initiatives through 55 recommendations which fall under 5 areas of focus. Firstly, data and research to deliver useful industry-based information about the nature of sexual harassment and effective responses. Secondly, primary prevention of sexual harassment through education, media and community-wide initiatives. Thirdly, a refocused legal and regulatory framework which recognises the mutually reinforcing roles of discrimination, workplace and safety laws. Fourthly, better workplace prevention and responses which are leader-driven, practical and adaptable. And finally, better support, advocacy and advice for people who experience sexual harassment. And for today's webinar, I'll focus on the data and research, the primary prevention and the support, advice and advocacy recommendations in our report. So starting with data and research, the inquiry showed that there are still evidence gaps in our knowledge on sexual harassment, which is why we made recommendations about improving that knowledge. We recommended that the Commission continue to conduct a national survey every 4 years, collecting detailed industry data collection across all population groups. We also recommended that agencies which handle workplace sexual harassment matters agree a de-identified data set relating to workplace sexual harassment, to create a coordinated system of annual reporting on workplace sexual harassment metrics, and establish formal information sharing and data exchange arrangements. This would help with further efforts to model the economic cost of sexual harassment and also improve prevention. Lastly, we recommended that a national sexual harassment research agenda be developed to identify priorities for sexual harassment research and contribute to the national evidence base on sexual harassment. And we've recommended that ANROWS lead this work, and I appreciate ANROWS hosting this event for us today. Then in primary prevention, the Our Watch submission to the inquiry noted, and I quote, "Sexual harassment is not confined to workplaces. The high rate of sexual harassment experienced by women in many other areas, including public spaces, social venues and online contexts, points to the need for a holistic approach to what is a broad social problem." The inquiry found that any primary prevention efforts developed to address sexual harassment should be informed by the Change the Story framework for the primary prevention of violence against women and children. Through the inquiry, we identified some areas that should be immediately prioritised for the primary prevention of sexual harassment. Firstly, a national awareness campaign to increase knowledge and change behaviours that drive sexual harassment, backed by a social change strategy. Secondly, targeted initiatives which address sexual harassment of populations at higher risk of sexual harassment, including those who experience discrimination. Thirdly, targeted education of young people, including those at school and in tertiary education, that recognises sexual harassment as a form of gender-based violence. And we recommended those three first areas of work be led by Our Watch, and I'm looking forward to hear what Paddy will have to say on this shortly. We also recommended the development of media guidelines to ensure responsible, victim-centred and gender-responsive reporting of sexual harassment by the media, and also government leadership to incorporate sexual harassment as a key area for action and investment under future national frameworks and state-level strategies to address violence against women and promote gender equality. Finally, we also made a number of recommendations in the support, advice and advocacy area. Throughout the inquiry, we were told, again I quote, that despite greater attention being given to sexual harassment in the workplace in recent years, very little has changed on the ground in terms of the information, supports and services available to victim survivors. Support services for victim survivors remain underdeveloped, under-resourced and difficult to navigate. So from what we heard, we made the following recommendations: that there be further investment in existing services which provide information, resources and referral services to victims, and the development of guidelines to support standardisation across information and referral services. Adequate resourcing of legal and commissions and community legal centres to provide quality legal advice and advocacy to victims of sexual harassment. And the Commission heard repeatedly of the importance of timely access to specialist counselling for victims of sexual harassment. Given the prominence and existing expertise of the 1800 RESPECT hotline, the Commission recommended that it be funded and expanded to support sexual harassment victims. The Commission found that support, advice and advocacy should be delivered in a holistic way, providing as seamless an experience as possible for victims and other people affected by workplace sexual harassment. This could involve smooth and speedy referrals between services or access to an all-inclusive support, advice and advocacy service. Working women's centres are well placed to provide these services, and we saw that in action. And we recommended that the government consider establishing or re-establishing them in all jurisdictions. And I look forward to hearing from Claire more on how the Northern Territory Working Women's Centres provide such a service. So this is the start of a new conversation. Our world has changed dramatically since our report was tabled in Parliament on the 5th of March this year. The need to address sexual harassment has not lessened. However, the immediate priority for our government and many workplaces has changed, and rightly so. As an audience whose work focuses on eliminating violence against women, I really do appreciate you attending these sessions to ensure we don't lose momentum, and I look forward to hearing the reflections of my fellow panellists. I also encourage you, the participants, to continue to send in questions over the chat for us to answer after our presentations. So back to you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really want to congratulate you on the report, and particularly the wide-ranging, concrete and practical recommendations that you've made. I also want to thank you, Kate, for reminding us that, in fact, sexual harassment in the workplace has been unlawful in this country for more than 30 years now. And it's so disturbing to hear about these, the terrible impacts that sexual harassment in the workplace has that you've brought out in the report. And this is still going on despite, not having been, despite having been prohibited in 1984. So it really is a very important and timely report that you've produced. And as I said, I think that the recommendations, 55 recommendations, are wide-ranging, but certainly very practical and has, should bring about, implementation of these recommendations should bring about the significant change that we need to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. So congratulations, Kate, and thank you again for that overview. Now, over to you, Paddy. So as CEO of Our Watch, and I, like Kate, am keen to hear about the work of Our Watch and how the Sexual Harassment in the Workplace report, Respect at Work, intersects with your work, and how, what Our Watch will be doing to progress the recommendations of the report.
Thanks very much, Heather, and thank you for hosting such an important event to give this report the profile it deserves. I'll too start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of the lands we all meet on, and particularly acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung people from where I'm coming from today. Our Watch is a national not-for-profit organisation established in 2013 by the Victorian and Commonwealth governments. Since then, all governments, states and territories have joined as members. Like ANROWS, Our Watch is an initiative of the National Plan to reduce violence against women and their children, and our work complements that of ANROWS and works closely with key organisations like the Australian Human Rights Commission. The work of Our Watch is about primary prevention, so stopping violence before it starts. And whilst we work in close partnership with our colleagues from the response sector, like Claire, who you will hear from today, we don't work directly with individual women who might be victims of gendered violence or men who might be perpetrators. Our role is to drive nationwide change in the structures, norms and practices that create an environment where violence against women is more likely to occur. We do this work by working in partnership with schools, sporting organisations, governments, workplaces and the media to address what the evidence tells us drives violence against women. So we build and share evidence, develop practical tools and resources, and support governments to develop plans. And we also lead a range of campaigns to talk to specific audiences like young people, young adults, and to speak to the community more broadly. Primary prevention is a vital part of this puzzle. It's holistic. It addresses violence against women. It's big picture, it's long term, and it's ambitious work that serves to drive change in our community. Importantly, it only works when done in partnership with other vital parts of the puzzle. Experts, like many of you today, working across the spectrum of response, policing, the law, housing, research, and specialists working with specific groups in our community. In terms of how the sexual harassment in the workplace fits our work and how this report intersects with our work, in 2015, Our Watch launched a shared framework for the national prevention of violence against women, and it's called Change the Story. Change the Story is a world-first, whole-of-country framework that was produced in partnership with Vic Health and with ANROWS. As a framework, the definition that Change the Story uses for violence against women is one that is shared with the National Plan and the United Nations, stating that any act of gender-based violence that causes or could cause physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of harm and coercion in public and private life. So this definition encompasses all forms of violence against women, including violence and abuse that occurs in homes, in social and recreational contexts, on the street, in schools or online, and in workplaces. And it includes violence at the hands of perpetrators who are known or unknown to the victim. So sexual harassment in the workplace is recognised as a form of violence against women and is covered by or included in Change the Story. In August last year, the Council of Australian Governments launched the 4th Action Plan under the National Plan. It outlines 5 national priorities, the 4th of which is to respond to sexual violence and sexual harassment. So sexual harassment in the workplace is very much a part of a national approach to reducing all violence against women. Our Watch's role in that national approach is to stop violence against women before it starts, and this includes stopping sexual harassment in the workplace. How do we do that? Well, Change the Story brings together international research and nationwide experience on what drives violence against women, including sexual harassment in the workplace. What Change the Story makes clear is that gender inequality is the core of the problem and it is the heart of the solution. Evidence shows that violence against women is much more likely to occur when power, opportunities and resources are not shared equally between men and women in society or in the workplace, and when women are not valued and respected as much as men. The good news is violence against women, including workplace sexual harassment, is not inevitable. Like other forms of violence against women, however, workplace sexual harassment needs a substantial and sustained effort to eradicate it. The Respect at Work report shows a solid way forward, and I too will take this opportunity to congratulate the Australian Human Rights Commission and Commissioner Jenkins for the development of this report. Respect at Work shows that addressing sexual harassment in Australian workplaces requires a holistic approach. So as well as reforming legal responses and improving systems to better respond to survivors, we need primary prevention efforts to stop it before it starts. Gender inequality and power imbalances in individual workplaces must be shifted in order to address the underlying drivers of sexual harassment. This includes addressing the gender pay gap, insecure work such as underemployment and casualisation, and addressing the unpaid care gap. I mentioned earlier that Our Watch is already supporting workplaces to address the drivers of violence against women. I'll just tell you a little about that. Our Watch helps workplaces to create a new normal where women feel welcome and are treated equally to men, whether it's in the factory, in the office, or in the boardroom. We do this through a product called Workplace Equality and Respect. Workplace Equality and Respect is a whole of organisation approach that gives workplaces the standards, processes and tools to make change that will support progress towards gender equality in our society and in their workplace. There are 5 workplace equality and respect standards all organisations can work towards to ensure gender equality and respect and to lay a foundation of workplaces free from sexual violence. Commitment, which is about being committed to preventing sexual harassment and violence against women and having structures, strategies and policies that explicitly promote gender equality. Conditions, which is about embedding gender equality in recruitment, remuneration and in promotion processes. Culture, which is about making sure that all staff feel safe and confident. Support, which means having the structures, practices and culture to ensure appropriate responses to staff and external stakeholders who experience violence, bullying and sexual harassment. And core business, which means the work of the organisation, or the business does, and the way it promotes that work aligns to its commitment to gender equality and to the prevention of sexual harassment and violence against women. Workplace Equality and Respect is freely available to workplaces and can be found at workplaces.ourwatch.org.au. I take this opportunity to thank the Human Rights Commission for the report. It intersects beautifully with other national work going on, and Our Watch will be working very hard to implement the recommendations. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks very much for that overview of Our Watch. It really does highlight just how the work intersects beautifully, as you say, Paddy. That this is work that you've been undertaking in some way for a number of years now, in collaboration with a number of other organisations, including ANROWS, but also the Australian Human Rights Commission and others. And that this report then provides a very concrete sort of set of recommendations that intersect directly with your work, but also helps lift the work that you've been doing to a higher level and gives it more impetus, I suppose, and a higher profile in some regard across a wider range of organisations within Australia and the broader community in general. So it's really great that we can have this opportunity to bring together for our audience just how synergistic these two pieces of work are. I certainly wish you well, Paddy, in the continuing work that Our Watch does. It's incredibly important and has been incredibly valuable to date, and I know will continue to provide such a vital response to prevention of violence against women in all its forms in Australia. So I want to turn now to Claire. Claire, can you tell us about the Northern Territory Working Women's Centre, and in particular the experience of the centre in responding to sexual harassment in the workplace?
Thank you, Heather. I'd like to pay my respects to the Larrakia and Aranda people upon whose lands the NT Working Women's Centre offices are based. So the NT Working Women's Centre is a community-based not-for-profit organisation. We've been operating in the NT for about 25 years, and we have offices in both Alice Springs and Darwin, and I'm speaking to you from Alice today. We provide information, advice and support about work-related issues, and our clients come to us with a wide range of work-related queries and problems, from paying conditions to workplace bullying, discrimination and frequently sexual harassment. We see our clients face-to-face and on the phone from all across the territory. 50% of our clients are outside of Darwin in remote areas, and for many of the women who contact us, they live many hours, if not a couple of days drive away from a regional and remote centre. We are a women's service, but we extend our services to trans people, genderqueer people, intersex people, brother boys and sister girls. And we're a feminist organisation, and we have a feminist model of working with our clients. So we provide support, information, advice and advocacy. And in terms of sexual harassment, we offer a large range of non-legal service options. Our clients share their experience with us. We ask them what they're looking for from our service, and then we do our best to provide that. Our clients lead the process, and they determine which course of action, if any, they would like to take. In terms of sexual harassment, unsurprisingly, we see a range of actions perpetrated against the women who come to see us, a wide range of physical and psychological abuses in a wide range of industries at all levels of employment. Many of the clients who come to see us experience sexual harassment, and it's compounded by an extra level of vulnerability, or that person is experiencing discrimination on the basis of multiple protected attributes. So for instance, we see they've been sexually harassed, but they may also have a disability. They have been sexually harassed at work, and they may also be a culturally and linguistically diverse woman or a migrant woman. They've been sexually harassed, plus they're a visa holder, which binds them to that job. It's very common for the women we see to have little support in the Northern Territory because they've come here for work, so they don't have lots of friends and family surrounding them. Many of the women who report to us are also very physically isolated. And so we see women who are reporting sexual harassment who are in remote mining camps, remote building sites, participating in remote roadworks and remote cattle stations. And very commonly in these settings, and particularly in these remote settings, they're one of few women on site, if not the only woman on site. And sadly, I can think of more than several cases where there has been sexual harassment that's taken place in the workplace, and that has led to sexual assault outside of work hours or off the work site. In the cases that I'm thinking of, the employers knew about the perpetrator's behaviour within the workplace but didn't take it seriously, and so it wasn't stopped before it escalated. There are some other commonalities, I think, in the way women we see manage the sexual harassment. So they're always managing the reactions of other people in their lives. So, for instance, they're hiding the impact of the sexual harassment on their kids because they feel they need to be strong, or they're managing the emotions and the reactions of their boyfriends and partners because they're worried or afraid about how they might react, or they're having to support boyfriends, partners and family members to process what has happened to them. Some women report sharing this with a partner who has then confronted the workplace or the perpetrator themselves, and other women report hiding it from their partners completely because of worries about how they will react, which of course, that fearfulness and the hiding the experience, that fear of retaliation, that's all driven by the same systems that allow sexual harassment to happen in the first place. Very few of our clients report sexual harassment to their employers or make formal complaints. Also, very sadly, many of our clients report being more impacted by the employer's response when they do report than by the sexual harassment itself, and that's the same in formal complaints processes. So many of our clients find the process of formal complaint to be actually more to have more of an impact upon them than the incidents itself. commonalities in responses by employers when there are disclosures of sexual harassment, and almost always, in our experience, inappropriate responses. So there is always mistrust of the victim's story, and that mistrust may be around the facts of what took place, the facts of the sexual harassment itself, or the mistrust of the impact it has had on the complainant. We very frequently, almost always, see more concern about the liability that might emerge for the employer in engaging the perpetrator in a complaints process, a performance management or addressing their conduct, or a termination process. There's more worries about the liability that arise from that than the liabilities that may arise from not doing anything about the complaint. When action is taken by the employer, we see that employers tend to, they expect rapid resolution of the issue, and then they're really surprised when the victim doesn't feel that it's resolved. And commonly this is because of ongoing exposure to the perpetrator or fear of exposure to the perpetrator. We very commonly see changes in the terms and the conditions of the victim's employment as opposed to the perpetrators. In fact, almost always, that's what the adjustments that are made within the workplace. And if we look at our clients, and I think about our clients who've made formal complaints, all find that to be a really hard process. Poor treatment by their employers continues into that formal complaint space. Of course, they never get admissions that the behaviour has taken place, that the perpetrator did the wrong thing or the employer did the wrong thing by not adequately preventing the sexual harassment. Formal settlements always involve a non-admission of liability and the signing of confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. So I think for us and our clients, we are often left with no sense of a satisfactory result, and certainly not a feeling of justice. So as a practitioner and a service, I think that we have, as a practitioner and as a service at the NT Working Women's Centre, there is an overall feeling of a great disillusionment with the current system. It does not serve victims and complainants, and so of course we really welcome this report. Yeah. Thank you, Heather.
Much for explaining that, Claire, and it really does bring home just the challenges that you face in your work and many other frontline workers do in providing support to women who are directly impacted by sexual harassment in the workplace and violence against women more generally. It also highlights, as you say, the importance of this report and its concrete recommendations to be able to address some of the issues that you've raised about the response that you get from employers and workplaces when there are reports of sexual harassment in the workplace. So thanks very much for providing that. Now, I want to turn to a panel discussion now, but in particular I'd like to unpack a couple of recommendations, and Patty, we'll turn to you first. So recommendation 8 is that our watch lead the development of evidence-based strategies for the prevention of sexual harassment, including implementation, monitoring and evaluation. So could you talk a little bit about that and how our watch will respond to that recommendation?
Thanks very much, Heather. It's an incredibly important recommendation. When Respect at Work was first published, we called for action on all the recommendations as a matter of urgency, given the prevalence of sexual harassment across the Australian workforce. At this stage, we haven't been funded specifically to work on recommendation 8, but it's work that must be done, as workplaces are a really important part of the puzzle in creating an Australia where women are safe and equal and valued. Every workplace conversation, policy and action has the potential to either reinforce or challenge gender inequality and the kinds of attitudes and norms that drive violence. But these actions have influence extending well outside the individual workplace, because employees are also parents, coaches, consumers and producers of social media, church leaders, CFA volunteers and so on. And what both Respect at Work report tells us and Change the Story makes clear is that preventing violence against women, including workplace sexual harassment, is part of a much bigger picture. So efforts to prevent violence against women must be multi-pronged and mutually reinforcing in all the places we spend our time. So sport, home, education, in our interaction with the media, and of course in workplaces. So we cannot implement recommendations of respect at work or even undertake workplace equality and respect in workplaces only and expect that the incidence of violence against women in workplaces will reduce. The message of equality and respect for women must be present in every part of our life, as we said, at home, in sport, on TV, and in our workplaces. So whilst Recommendation 8 hasn't been specifically funded, we know that if we're going to reduce violence, sexual harassment in the workplace, we need to undertake work in all of those places. So in that way, our watch, in partnership with many others, is already going really deep in this work. Respect for relationships in schools, equality and respect in sport, the development of media guidelines for journalists reporting on violence, the development of campaigns that are both targeted to specific groups like young people or the community more broadly. And you will have seen the launch of one such campaign last week called No Excuse for Abuse, which highlights non-physical forms of sexual violence, and of course workplace equality and respect specifically designed for workplaces. So all of these things together create an environment where gender equality is promoted and normalised and where violence against women is not acceptable, including workplace sexual harassment. So we'd certainly like more support to implement Recommendation 8, but it's important to know that there's a lot of work going on across the whole environment to reduce sexual harassment in the workplace. Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. And good point, well made about the sexual harassment is part of a bigger picture, and as it was pointed out earlier, we need a holistic approach, and that's certainly the approach that our watch takes to all of its work. So thanks for that. So Claire, if we can turn to you, and there's a recommendation for working women's centres being part of implementing a holistic approach of addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. Would you like to comment on that specifically?
Thank you. We're really heartened to see that recommendation. The holistic approach, as per the recommendation, is actually is already how we do things here at the NT Working Women's Centre, and it's how our sister organisations, which is the Working Women's Centre South Australia and the Queensland Working Women's Centre, also operate. The recommendation, though, is for an extension of this work so that existing services such as us can do more, and so those services can be extended into other states and territories. I think the value in this is the all-inclusive service, which includes many non-legal options, so support, advice and advocacy, and there's a great breadth to what Working Women's Centres can do. We're specialist women's services, and so given the disproportionate number of women who are affected and the intersectional discrimination that's taking place, expert women's services are really valuable in matters of sexual harassment. Working Women's Centres we're easy to carry, we have local expertise, and we don't necessarily have the boundaries to access that other organisations and services can have because of fear and mistrust. And I think we have an important dual role, which is that Working Women's Centres are at the coal face, but we're also able to participate in that systemic and structural advocacy, which I think is really important. And I think it's important also to recognise that continuation and an expansion of Working Women's Centres complements the other recommendations, but it also is complementary to the work by other organisations and other frontline services. I'm particularly thinking of here of unions, of community legal centres, and of counselling and social services. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Claire. And certainly there's a lot of expertise in your organisation and others similar that can be brought to bear in furthering the goals and recommendations of the report. The next question I'd like to put to each of the panel members, and we'll start with the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins. So Kate, just thinking about our audience today, predominantly frontline workers, how can they respond to respect at work, at the report, and issues surrounding sexual harassment in the workplace? What kind of roles and opportunities are there for frontline workers to get involved in this work?
Yes, and I really welcome even the interest and the involvement of participating today. I would encourage you to think about your particular role and think about where you can incorporate the expertise and the new thinking in the report. And I can probably just show you. So the full report, which some of you might know, is quite substantial, beautifully written, and in fact easy to access with great stories, including stories like you've heard from the Northern Territory Working Women's Centres that really bring to life really clearly what the problem is. But also, even though I want you to all read that or at least dip in and out of that, we did produce, as you would, a community guide, which in there is a 20-page executive summary. So for anyone participating, I'd actually encourage you to start there because as I think both the other panellists, but particularly Patty, talked about the big picture, when you read the big picture, it all makes complete sense. And then I'd encourage you to think about what in your work you can incorporate in how you might change your practice. If you are in a role where you have any opportunity to advocate to government on getting a response and funding, we always will ask for that. But the other area that you might think about is just because you are more than likely in a workplace with an employer, so putting aside your professional functions and responsibilities, it might be you've experienced sexual harassment, you've witnessed it, or you're a manager, or you've even perpetrated sexual harassment. My other request is pretty much for everyone to reflect on the findings and think about what opportunities are there in your organisation to take steps to prevent sexual harassment and make the workplace safer and more productive for everyone. So that's sort of the other side of it, is every workplace has a role to play.
Thanks, Kate. Patty, would you like to add anything to that?
I'd certainly endorse everything that Kate's just said, but what I'd say to everybody who's listening today is that by virtue of the fact that you have bothered to be here means that you have a leadership role and that you have some influence to bear in your own organisations. Now that means understanding and knowing about this work that the three of us have talked about, but I would really say don't undervalue what you have to put in. So that's either taking bystander action at work, if you're in a leadership role, that you actually take this work to your leadership group and that you actually then look to see how you can implement that in other parts of your life. But the tide is turning. There is a lot of conversation about violence against women and how we prevent that and what everybody's role is. We all know we spend a lot of time at work. So you can feel more secure that if you bring this up, you've got the evidence behind you, you can ring anybody on screen today to get support, that you actually take the step, take a leadership role, do something in your workplace that contributes to making it safer. Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Patty. And what about you, Claire?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think that in terms of thinking about disclosures of sexual harassment in the workplace, I think that one of the most important things that employers and colleagues can do is to believe the person who is making the disclosure, to deal with it swiftly and in consultation with the person who is reporting it and seeking expert advice when you need to. And in terms of thinking about the report, well, the Human Rights Commission has done all the background work here, and now I feel as organisations and businesses we have a responsibility to push the government to take up the recommendations and not with a light touch. The recommendations in this report from a practitioner point of view are well considered and they are clever. They take existing processes and services, commissions, legislations, and they make changes in order to make this system more effective. And we need a commitment from our government to most, if not all, of the recommendations, rather than just one or two if we want to see change.
Great, thank you so much for that. We're going to turn soon to Q&A, but I just wanted to, I suppose, bring the webinar presentations to a close by summarising some of what we've heard today. And, you know, it's really highlighted for me that despite having prohibition on sexual harassment in the workplace for more than 30 years in this country, we're still seeing such devastating impacts on women in the workplace. But we're also hearing about hope and the work that Our Watch and others are doing. You know, we're hearing about the support from for women directly through organisations like the Working Women's Centre. We're hearing about the prevention work that organisations, that Our Watch is doing nationally, and there's work going on at state and territory levels as well in terms of prevention work. And Patty talked quite a bit about hope. You know, you gave us hope, Patty, for a better future, but we know hope's not a strategy. And so it's really so vitally important that we've got this excellent report, Respect at Work, that provides concrete, practical recommendations for a future free from sexual harassment in the workplace, and indeed contributes to the overall effort to end violence against women in our country in total. So I want to thank the panel there now before we move into the Q&A session. So remember, you can submit your questions by clicking the blue icon at the top right-hand of your screen. So click that blue icon and submit your question, and we'll be happy to take those questions and answer as many as we can. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that again. And we have received many questions from the audience. We'll try to get through as many as we can, and it may be that we go a little bit over time. If we, I'm sure that we'll have some very important responses to the questions that we have to ask. But for our first question, I'm going to go to Commissioner Kate Jenkins. Kate, Respect at Work was written before we were in the global health pandemic. Has COVID changed how we should address sexual harassment in the workplace, and how will the recommendations be addressed? I'm going to start with Kate and then go to the other panellists.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, the report was released actually on the 5th of March, which we now understand was when the pandemic had started, but before the country had really understood the impact. And at that point, the Attorney General's Department had committed and continues to commit to review the report and come back with its response. And we know for government there are legislative change provisions in there and funding requests, but the reality is most of the report makes recommendations to a broad range of people, but particularly about workplaces. So I think what happens with COVID is the place for action actually just goes straight to workplaces, and particularly those that have got some bandwidth to really think about this. Sexual harassment hasn't gone away. In fact, we know online sexual harassment has increased, although the physical touching type of harassment obviously has fallen away. But we know, for example, that eSafety Commissioners provided a range of resources to deal with that. So we know that the behaviour continues and the problem continues and hasn't gone away. So my suggestion is that there's a couple of things that can happen pretty much straight away. Firstly, I would look to workplaces, particularly to look at the workplace chapter and think about changing their processes. The laws already make sexual harassment unlawful. Our recommendations strengthen that, but the reality is we found a lot of organisations weren't really meeting their legal obligations. And one of the suggestions for this audience is to think about connecting with organisations like the Northern Territory Working Women's Centres, or go to ANROWS or Our Watch to think of help. The other thing that this conversation reminds us is that gender equality, as gender inequality being one of the key drivers of sexual harassment, reminds us that we must continue those efforts on gender equality. And Patty in particular is really strong at articulating how that works, and their resources are really helpful there. So there's a number of things that can be done to already implement those recommendations.
Thanks, Kate. Patty, do you want to add to that then and perhaps mention those resources?
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks, Kate. I think as Kate alludes to, we need to stay really focused on the actual incidence of sexual harassment in our workplace, but our responsibility is also to create a whole organisation that promotes gender equality, and therefore, you know, we create an environment where it's less likely to occur. So we're encouraging leaders in organisations to have a look at their data right now and say, how many women are in the leadership roles that are making decisions about how our organisation rebuilds into the future? What does our data tell us about the amount of people who were laid off? When we rebuild our organisation, what are the things we're going to stick to? We're hearing quite a bit about people saying, well, the gender equality stuff or the cultural diversity stuff or the inclusion stuff sits to the side. We've really got to get our organisation going. What we're saying is, no, don't put it to the side. Include it into the DNA of the rebuild of your organisation as you go forward. So the workplace equality and respect resource is one that we're pointing people to, but I just keep encouraging people to know that if they create an environment where gender equality is promoted and normalised, then over time we're going to see less incidents. Thanks, Heather.
Great, thanks, Patty. Claire, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Thank you. I think the only thing I would like to add is just from an employer's point of view is to be aware that even though there may be less people physically in a workplace at the moment, that sexual harassment takes multiple forms, and I didn't talk much today about sexual harassment over the phone or email or that sort of thing, but of course there's a new work environment creates new opportunities for harassment to occur, and so that's a really important thing to be aware of. And I'd also just reiterate what Kate and Patty said about as people head back to work, this is a really important opportunity to rebuild in a certain way and to incorporate these discussions into the rebuild. And it's a valuable time to be doing policy work while our workplaces look different and we're quieter in other areas.
Great. And while you've got the floor, Claire, and it's a nice segue to the next question from the audience that I'll ask you to respond to first. There have been a few questions actually from the audience related to human resources, particularly if there are recommended policy or procedural guidelines for responding to workplace sexual harassment.
Sure, I'll have some ideas about that. I think it's important from an employer perspective that, look, there is no one-size-fits-all for dealing with complaints about sexual harassment. But there are some policy and procedural necessities, I think, and I think there are some important considerations in regards to approach. So first of all, it's important to have a policy on sexual harassment. Many organisations and businesses don't, even larger ones, and ideally also a code of conduct. Within that policy, sexual harassment policy, you need to have a clear definition of what sexual harassment is. There's plenty of information on our website and the Australian Human Rights Commission websites about what sexual harassment is. I would provide examples of inappropriate behaviour and state in your policy that this is different from mutual attraction and friendship and respect. I think it's important to nominate several different people to whom complainants can report sexual harassment to, so they can pick which relationship they trust the most and then use that avenue. I think it's important to clearly state the procedures that will be used to deal with sexual harassment and have some procedural options from informal to formal complaint, and how investigations and how those will be conducted. So it's very, very clear to complainants exactly what is going to happen if they disclose. In terms of approach, I think policies and procedures need to have a real focus on safety, on complainant safety, and a real focus on a consultative approach. We do a lot of training and development in domestic and family violence disclosures at work and that employer responsibility, and our mantra in that space is nothing about her without her, and I would say that is absolutely appropriate in sexual harassment complaints, that you need to be consulting with the person who's made the complaint about what you're going to do next and how they feel about that. I think it's important to get expert advice and training. There's information on the Our Watch Workplace Equality and Respect website about some tips and hints about policy development, the same on our website. And finally, I think the most important thing is to broadcast the policy, discuss it, and to normalise discussions about sexual harassment and what is appropriate and not appropriate behaviour in the workplace. This is really important for preventative work, as Patty has discussed in detail, but it also has the effect of creating an environment in which people feel safe to disclose sexual harassment, and really importantly, because no one will admit to sexual harassment, is that it's important in terms of for bystanders and witnesses feeling comfortable and confident to also disclose if they see something. Thanks. Heather?
Thanks, Claire. Thanks. Claire. Patty or Kate, would either of you in turn like to make any further comment on that?
Nothing from me, Heather.
No.
Okay,
I'll just say,
Patty.
I guess, Heather, my one comment is that our finding, the report does talk a lot about what good looks like, and I'd recommend people go there, but the one thing that was really clear to me was that lots of leaders and organisations thought that if they had ticked the box of having a policy, that they had done what they had to do. And as Claire's described, there's a real difference between one person writing a policy that exists on a website and it becoming to life. So one of the best things we saw about policies, or that I really liked, was the media industry now has all agreed one uniform policy. So as you move from organisation to organisation, I know there's some questions about temporary work. There's no need to just re-engage and learn over again a new policy. The principles are the principles are the principles.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Good advice. And maybe connected to that really is a further question here that I'll put to you first, Patty, as CEO of Our Watch, but it relates to management of resistance to policy and procedures around managing or responding to workplace sexual harassment. And so from your experience as CEO of Our Watch, what do you suggest are effective ways to prevent or manage resistance to or backlash in promoting gender equality and respectful relationships in the workplace?
Thanks, Heather. The key thing about backlash and resistance is that it's a real thing and you can't just let it happen accidentally. You actually have to be quite proactive about it. So it's actually quite a normal part of any change process. When things change, many people's response is to either push back or because they feel uncertain or threatened, or they actually just disagree with the change. So if you're leading initiatives in your workplace to prevent violence against women or sexual harassment, thinking about backlash is actually a part of your planning, and it will reduce the risk over time and increase your progress. So you actually need to physically prepare a list of the possible drivers of backlash. Have the evidence-based responses ready for those concerns that come up. Be clear about what your role is in change. That is, what you say, how you act, what you choose to measure, and where you spend your time. So you actually have to have practical strategies to support you, ready and embedded in your change management process. A bit like the way we all say now, you include evaluation into your project plan. You don't do it at the end. Backlash and resistance needs to be included in your management plan all the way through. The other thing that you need to do is have staff ready to go and make sure they're engaged at all levels. So what are the, sorry, I lost my spot there. What are the possible sites of backlash? What knowledge and skills do staff need, and how are you going to connect to them really positively about this? If you're not leading, but you're trying to drive change from within, that can be trickier. You still need to do all of the things I said, but you almost need to look to external experts, do your board or your CEO respect to convince them. And it could be presentations to your board, connect with male champions of change or people like Kate to come and talk to your leadership group. Consider working with victim survivors and present them to your leadership group so they connect to why this work is actually important. And I'm sure Kate might add some things from her report to this list, but again, there's tips on the Workplace Equality and Respect website, but in that website we also connect to a great resource that Male Champions of Change did called Backlash and Buy-In. So yeah, my key thing is be prepared and treat it like a real thing.
Yeah, that's great. Good advice and very clear. Thanks, Patty. And Kate, would you like to add to that?
No, I think those comments are really good. We do discuss this issue in our report. My only one personal view is I've noticed, I think up until now, people have thought that you answer backlash by just telling the people that they're wrong, and we now have some really sophisticated understanding that if someone, you know, is opposed to promoting gender equality, then telling them that they're wrong probably could drive them to be more in opposition. So there's sophistication on the multiple ways you deal with that. It is, Patty's talking about it, Vic Health's also done some good work, and our report describes some of those good practices. But again, I notice the questions have recognised it's a real thing in the police forces. You know, addressing it really directly is actually, you know, a constructive and clever way to engage people.
Thanks, Kate. What about you, Claire? Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I don't think I have much to add. Those were incredibly comprehensive and useful answers for me as well. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you. So there's a couple of more questions that have come in, and they're kind of related, so I'm going to try to meld them together a bit, and then we'll start with you, Claire, to answer them. But first of all, there are a few questions related to strengthening bystander action, but kind of related to that is the concern or fear about talking to victims about sexual harassment. And picking up the point you made, Claire, about nothing about her without her, what are the right questions to ask the person who you feel or are aware has experienced sexual harassment? So what questions do you ask to gather information about sexual harassment?
Sure. I think actually the key to having discussions with someone who has experienced or is a victim of sexual harassment is in the preparation. And so that is making sure that there is a safe environment in which to have a conversation. Some of that is doing the groundwork in terms of, talking regularly about appropriate behaviours and that sort of thing, so that person knows that what the organisational standard is. But then it's about speaking to that person about, okay, where do you want to have this conversation and who would you like to be present, and are you going to take notes or not, and what will you do with those notes? What are you going to do with the information the person gives you during the conversation, so that the person knows where the conversation is going to take, and it's all very predictable in terms of who will be in the room and what the environment will be like. The next thing I think is that it's important to have hard conversations, and you just have to be. When I have these conversations with people, I ask them to start from where they think the beginning is. So where do you think this started? And take me through it, perhaps in chronological order, and to feel comfortable to ask gentle, probing questions. I think it's important to be aware that people who have experienced trauma often tell stories in a way that might seem very jumbled or confused to you, and that's a normal reaction to a traumatic event. And so you need to be prepared to gently guide that conversation from, could you go back to what happened after this time and this date, so that you can get the details that you need. And I think it's important also to have on hand some referrals that you can make at the end of that conversation. So if you've got an employee assistance program, so you know that if you're having a hard conversation, then you're having a conversation about something that is very upsetting, that you then can make appropriate referrals to expert organisations, and that can be places like working women's centres, but also counselling services and that sort of thing. I think I touched on bystander. Oh, sorry, Heather, on you go.
No, that's okay. Was there something you wanted to say?
I was just going to say quickly about bystanders is that the importance of bystanders and witnesses is, as I said before, it's very hard to get disclosures of sexual harassment from, or admissions of sexual harassment. And so it's important to create safety and trust for witnesses of sexual harassment too, so that they feel like they will be believed, or they don't feel like they need to cover things up.
Yeah, great. Good point. Patty, would you like to add anything to that?
Again, a bit like my previous comment, the work around bystanders needs to be quite well planned. So how does a bystander report if they see something that they don't feel comfortable saying something about? At Our Watch we talk about you can show your disapproval by not laughing or turning away or whatever, or you can support somebody later if you don't feel able to do that in the moment. But even if you support somebody later, you need to know what the processes are. You can challenge somebody in the moment, but you still, again, need to know what the processes are. So this is kind of the structural piece of it. Being a good bystander takes knowledge that the structures are sitting behind you, so you actually need to be able to describe what they are in practical terms as well. Thanks, Heather.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thanks. And Commissioner Kate Jenkins, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Just the last comment was really this issue came out of talking to victims and the role of victims in our report, and particularly the conflict between conflict, there shouldn't be a conflict, but that handling the welfare of the victim and encouraging them to get the care and support that they need versus treating them as a witness that you need to record their version of events. So one of my early conversations, there was a woman who said that she was sexually harassed in quite a graphic way. She had gone forward hoping the organisation would be better. She told her story, and then she had to keep retelling it to every different person that wanted to take a different record. And she said it was like describing a pornographic story each time, but she was in it, and that was incredibly distressing. So matching that sort of procedural fairness in the legal process with welfare of the victim first, I absolutely think it's possible, but I think our practices till now have really focused on a story as a piece of evidence in a misconduct case rather than a story as that person's experience that needs to be cared about in itself.
Sage words of advice there. Thank you very much for that, Kate Jenkins. So unfortunately, we don't have any more time for it. There are lots of questions that if we had more time, would be able to put to the panel, but unfortunately that's not the case. But I do want to sincerely thank you, the panel, for sharing your insights and knowledge about this important issue. And I want to thank the audience for watching the webinar and also for the questions that you've put forward, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. A recording of the webinar will be available on the ANROWS website for on-demand viewing in a couple of weeks. Please let your colleagues know about it if you've found this, as I did, this webinar very useful in terms of information about the report and strategies to respond to sexual harassment in the workplace. Then please let anyone who in your circle, your sphere of influence know about it. The Respect at Work report, Respect at Work Sexual Harassment National Inquiry report, is available on the Australian Human Rights Commission website, as is information about other upcoming webinars about the report. So this is one of several that Commissioner Kate Jenkins is doing to promote awareness of the report and its recommendations. The next ANROWS webinar is on Wednesday the 10th of June, and it's titled Strengthening Capacity for Multicultural and Settlement Services to Support Women Experiencing Violence.